We're working with two actually stem cell therapies, or actually some trophic factor companies, such as Athersys, where we actually can directly inject some growth factors that are gene modified. And that's one of the problems when they asked earlier about stem cell therapy, is that people don't realize with stem cell therapy usually involves some viruses. And obviously, once you start messing with viruses and putting in humans, there's a lot of other problems. That's one of the reasons why it's taking a little bit longer. If you just inject stem cells, they all die. You need something to keep those stem cells alive. And usually it's a virus. Once you start having viruses transmit genes to humans, obviously you open up Pandora's box of what can occur. So stem cell therapy is a lot more complicated than just injecting stem cells, which is what occurs in all those foreign countries. All those stem cells die. You have to have something else to keep those stem cells alive. So we're looking at injecting stem cells directly into the diaphragm. We actually have a biomarker, which is our EMG, that we can watch therapy. We found some other aspects. This is respiratory compliance in our ALS patients. Respiratory compliance is actually when you start blowing into a balloon, it's always harder to get it open. Then once it opens up, it's easier to breathe. We know in ALS patients, they actually are losing their muscle fibers, is that obviously the work for breathing increases. As, you know, most of us that treat a lot of ALS patients look around the audience and we'll see all the accessory muscles utilizing for breathing. That's increasing the work for breathing. That requires more energy. Our diaphragm is an extremely energy efficient muscle. You've never heard of anybody dying, from malnutrition, their diaphragm stopped working. I mean, it doesn't occur. We've actually tried to measure how much energy it takes for your diaphragm to move. We can't even measure it. It's such an efficient muscle. But your accessory muscles, where you have to use all those muscles to get each breath, that actually utilizes a lot of energy. That's type 2B muscle fiber. It's fast twitch muscle fiber. That's what you need to rest with your BiPAP machine, those type of muscles that are being utilized. So we showed that we increased respiratory compliance, which means we decrease the work for breathing by pacing patients at the same time, perhaps even with their BiPAP for many of our patients. The electrode itself, it's a percutaneous system. It's interesting, we actually, the electrodes were actually designed by one of my graduate students, Peterson. It's one of those things where my university didn't patent the electrode, interestingly. It's an interesting little electrode. It's 14 stainless steel wires, 2 double helixes of 7. We've never had any electrode break in a patient. We put 2 electrodes in each diaphragm. This is a device that controls and helps it. It comes out through the skin with 5 little wires. We usually put it at the opposite side of the feeding tube. We can control each electrode separately. So for each electrode, for those of you that might be electricians out there, it's a little bit easier than that chemical stuff that we were talking about earlier. You can control it with amplitude, frequency, rate, pulse width, pulse modulations. We splice these things together at times if somebody breaks it. It's actually very basic electrical stimulation parameters that we can utilize. What we saw, though, is once we started pacing these patients, an interesting aspect of our FDA trial is that if you read some of our earlier work, we said you do 30-minute sessions a day. But there was an out in our FDA trial. And so patients were allowed to utilize it more if they thought it was benefiting. And everybody says, why did I pick 30 minutes 5 times a day? I just made that up. It's interesting, as opposed to a drug trial, we have to do all these animal trials, we just guessed. And luckily we saw that actually you can utilize it a lot more. Our spinal cord injured patients, remember, utilize pacing 24 hours a day, every minute of every day for every breath. So we know that stimulating a diaphragm muscle by itself is not going to be problematic. Obviously, our initial pilot trial, we were hoping, obviously, we showed that it didn't cause any adverse effects by stimulating the muscle. And plus, kind of our background of electrical stimulation, we knew it wouldn't be a problem. But we listened to our patients, and our patients started coming in saying, well, sheepishly, oh, I use it every night. It helps me sleep. Or I utilize it all day long. It helps me get around better. So we started looking at it. It really goes back to why do they think this works in ALS? Direct stimulation increases muscle mass. And I'll kind of go over this in our results a little bit. There's an old theory of ALS called induction of nerve branching. Remember, when a motor neuron dies, there's an axon that goes down to one little piece of muscle. There's a theory that for a brief period of time, that little muscle, before it dies off, can get attached to another axon, another motor neuron. It goes back to some of our polio data, where actually when they lose some of those motor neurons, each axon that's left and each motor neuron actually controls more muscle. So there's a theory on trying to get more muscle controlled by the motor neurons that are left. There's a theory that electrical stimulation can help that nerve branching. That's very hard to duplicate in the humans because we're not actually biopsying the diaphragm. That's just theoretical. We know there's an afferent effect of stimulation. When I stimulate, we've shown this in animals, so if you have somebody if I stimulate that muscle, that motor neuron changes size. That type 1 and type 2 motor neurons actually are different size motor neurons, and you can convert them. So we're changing the way the motor neuron looks. It may actually have some benefit. We know that stimulation from all of our studies, that stimulating it converts all the diaphragm to type 1 muscle fiber. We know that from our spinal cord injury trial, from our ALS trials, we're doing that. And what we didn't expect, and which people kind of talked about in the past, is that we identified that ALS patients have central sleep apnea. All these aspects are actually our patients with upper motor neuron involvement. So when we start looking at our patient groups is that if you do have a pure lower motor neuron variant of ALS, which is a small, it's really not ALS, if it's all lower motor neuron, this won't work. If you have mostly lower motor neuron involvement, it's probably not as good. Those patients with more upper motor neuron, which is still kind of a nice predominant of patients initially presenting, this would work more, because pure upper motor neuron involvement is spinal cord injury. And we work for every one of those. We've never failed on getting a spinal cord injured patient off the ventilator. And so we get them all off the ventilator. Our goal in ALS is delay the ventilator. So kind of this slide kind of outlines that ALS spectrum. And again, you know, it's interesting when we start looking back at our patients who benefited the most. It's those with more upper motor neuron involvement. Sometimes we kind of make light. It's actually a little bit harder to differentiate upper and lower motor neuron, especially as the disease becomes more progressive. So it really started in this upper motor neuron loss. And actually in our pivotal ALS, our pivotal spinal cord trial, now this device is actually FDA approved now for spinal cord injury. And so the exact same device that we use for ALS and for spinal cord, it's the same device, same implantation. It is approved for under a humanitarian device exemption by FDA as of July of this year itself. So we actually have centers across the United States now implanting for spinal cord. Again, most of our patients utilize it 365 days a year in spinal cord injury. When we look at our spinal cord injured patients, as most of you realize, getting off the ventilator changes your life. Delaying a ventilator in ALS will obviously change your life, because that ventilator changes everything. Changes your ability to travel, your sense of smell. We just have a paper coming out of Paris, just the sense of smell alone. If you're on a ventilator, you can't smell, so your food changes differently. There's all these other aspects of trying to delay that ventilator. Here's all of our publications that have just come out this year alone about supporting upper motor neuron use. And it's something that I state this because this is what we're utilizing in our arguments with FDA right now, is that it's very similar to what we're utilizing in spinal cord. Because now I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the United States. But we have a lot of articles that works in upper motor neuron involvement, which is ALS is partly that. In spinal cord injured patient, it really is a quality of life aspect. I mean, obviously, I don't hear a ventilator in the room here. You know, usually when I give this talk to spinal cord groups is that somebody will be on a ventilator and everybody knows. It changes how people look at you. It changes your ability to travel. This is one of our patients who, a spinal cord injured patient who wanted to actually go out on a boat again. He designed a sip and puff sailboat so he could travel, you know, do what he liked doing, is sailing. You can't sail on a ventilator. So he actually is using our device out there. We also looked at electricity. In the hurricanes, really in Ike and in Ohio, where we lost a lot of electricity, is that if you're dependent on a ventilator, you either have to get a backup generator, and many of our ALS patients are dependent on BiPAP or cough assist or something else. You're worried about that loss of electricity. And obviously, this device actually has a little lithium battery. It's kind of like an Energizer size C. It's a little special battery, but it lasts 500 hours. And you just change the battery itself. So it changes, you're dependent on electricity, which, as we all know, when winter arrives or hurricane season, it's a problem. We also saw something about neuroplasticity. It's a hot topic. You heard people talk about, can we change what's happening around those motor neurons? Neuroplasticity is an interesting concept of recovery of function. That's what we want to recover. We actually found things just in the last year in our spinal cord injured patients as we started implanting earlier. So remember, a spinal cord injured patient, they suddenly lose part of their spinal cord. It's just a bruise. But we found patients on the top area there, you can see a patient that's not having any of that burst of activity. Then we paced them, and they recovered their own breathing on their own, which means that they opened up other pathways through that injury. So there's some evidence that electrical stimulation can actually help that milieu and actually have alternative pathways for function. So it's something we're very actively looking at in spinal cord injury. There's now studies coming out that early electrical stimulation may help in that regard. There's not been, you know, part of our data to start this project in ALS was actually some data out of Japan about it stimulating legs to maintain muscle mass. So there's some aspect about electrical stimulation may be of value. At least in the diaphragm, we can say that it's not going to hurt. It looks very promising. Obviously, our spinal cord device got FDA approval for age greater than 18. Obviously, it's indicated for spinal cord, but it does open up an interesting aspect is that lithium's not approved for ALS, but you can get it. It does show that actually this is the opportunity that we're discussing with FDA now, since it is an approved device, which means all the manufacturing, quality, safety of the device has all been approved by the FDA. And really, our results in ALS is driven by our results in spinal cord injury. Obviously, as the earlier speaker is that, you know, I founded the company because we couldn't find anybody else to do it, myself and my electrical engineer. One is that ALS is an orphan disease, and there's very few companies, only 3 that I know. The one that spoke earlier, our own company, that's actually focusing on ALS research. There's one other small biotech company out of Boston.